Here was a doorway in the rampart, the protective wall. The rampart is here and here. When the villagers looked out and saw the Romans coming up the access road, they must have been terrified. They quickly tried to fill up the doorways with anything they had handy, stones and mud bricks.
But the villagers' efforts were futile, and for having supported Caesar's rivals, many villages were sold into slavery, and the town of La Cloche was destroyed.
They leveled all the buildings and used the stones to fill up the water well so no one could live here again. The site was completely forgotten about for the next 500 years. It wasn't until the 5th century AD that the site was partially inhabited again, probably by shepherds.
After his easy victories in the west, Caesar returned to Rome. But the decisive battles were still ahead of him. He knew he had to defeat Pompey head-on to win control of the Roman state. And he led his army east towards the Balkans, where legion would meet legion.
Roman civil wars were often exceedingly bloody affairs because both sides were using the same tactics against the other, so casualties could often be pretty massive. And of course, as in any civil war, the psychological stresses of that must have been very difficult for the troops.
Because all legions had the same strict training, Roman civil wars were usually decided by generalship. And here, Caesar had the advantage.
Pompey was aging, he was not as decisive. Caesar moved his troops more quickly and was also quite good at deceiving his enemies as to his intentions.
After a first indecisive battle, the two Roman armies clashed in 48 BC at Pharsalus, north of Athens. Caesar correctly guessed Pompey's tactics, got the better of the battle, and forced Pompey's army to surrender.
I think Caesar wins the civil war for two reasons. Firstly, because his side is more unified than the opposition under Pompey. The second reason people don't like to talk about, but I think it's important, we have to admit that Caesar, throughout the campaigns against Pompey, had a series of pieces of good luck. Pharsalus was a piece of good luck, picking Pompey's tactics and strengthening that wing of his army to respond to them. It could have gone differently.
Pompey himself escaped to Egypt, but his former ally, the young pharaoh Ptolemy, had him killed on arrival. Pompey's head was presented to Caesar, who arrived 3 days later. Reportedly, Caesar wept, but realized through the tears that he was now the indisputable master of Rome. He came to an Egypt that was itself immersed in a power struggle. Young Ptolemy was fighting for the pharaoh's throne with his sister, 21-year-old Cleopatra. She set out to win Caesar's help in her battle and introduced herself in dramatic fashion, smuggling herself into Caesar's presence in a rolled-up carpet, and then suddenly revealing herself to him.
She was said to have a seductive voice and a kind of vitality and vivacity that was extremely attractive.
Her seduction worked. Caesar used his army to help install Cleopatra as sole ruler of Egypt under Rome's control. And then he spent several months sailing with Cleopatra on a barge up the Nile. He claimed he was safeguarding Rome's interests.
Egypt was vital if Caesar was to contain control of Rome and of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra, too, was looking to retain her position as Queen of Egypt. A wonderful coalition of the political and romantic.
When Caesar finally returned to Rome, his victory procession was perhaps the greatest the capital had ever seen. That night, Caesar treated some 200,000 citizens to a huge banquet. With Caesar now master of Rome, he released many of his long-serving troops, granting them retirement properties in Italy and France. But before very long, they would be called back into service to avenge their murdered general. In 46 BC, Caesar's power was so undeniable that he had the Senate name him dictator for 10 years, and later, dictator for life. But many Romans, with their republican tradition, abhorred this move, and jealousy among his rivals reached fever pitch. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, a group of senators attacked Caesar as he arrived for a meeting, stabbing him 23 times. Caesar fell dead, ironically, below a statue of Pompey.
He'd become too far ahead of the other competition. The only way to attempt to return things to normal was to eliminate him. In the years before his assassination, he'd begun to assume some of the attitude, some of the regalia, some of the titles of the Roman gods. He was murdered, in a sense, to show that he wasn't a god, in a last-ditch attempt to return the Roman state to a republic.
Caesar's murder opened the door to more civil war. On one side were Caesar's assassins and their supporters, on the other, those loyal to Caesar, including his designated heir, Octavian, and Caesar's deputy, Mark Antony. In the decisive battle in Greece in 42 BC, Caesar's old legions again won the day. Octavian and Mark Antony now shared rule of the empire between them. Octavian ruled the west from Rome and Antony the east from Egypt. But Octavian wanted all the power of Rome for himself, and Antony's very public love affair with Cleopatra in Egypt gave Octavian the propaganda tool he needed to turn Rome against his co-ruler.
It also allows Octavian to portray Antony as the unmanned Roman, the man who sybaritically on the banks of the Nile sails in scented sweetness with Cleopatra, when he should have been out there like any proper Roman, parading his troops, exercising on the parade ground.
Inevitably, it took another civil war to resolve the power struggle. The pivotal battle came at sea, near Actium on the Greek coast in 31 BC. Most of Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was sunk, and Antony's land legions began defecting. Antony and Cleopatra themselves escaped, but fearing their treatment by Octavian, they both committed suicide. Octavian was now the sole leader and became the first Roman emperor. He took the name Augustus, meaning the revered one, and used his adopted name Caesar, as would many future emperors. The Russian title Tsar is derived from the word Caesar. And so is the German title of Kaiser. Augustus's title emperor was a military one, from the Latin imperator, meaning victorious general. He had won his power through civil wars and was determined not to lose power the same way. He completely reorganized the Roman army, forming it into 28 legions of about 5,000 men each. He also made military service longer, having soldiers sign up not for 6 years, but for 20 years, and later 25. In return, soldiers were guaranteed 14 years' pay on retirement.
He keeps the idea of the legions, but he makes them for the first time permanent standing regiments. And they last, some of them thereafter, for about 500 years.
To make the soldiers loyal to him personally, instead of to their generals, Augustus paid the soldiers' wages directly from the imperial treasury. He also paid them annual cash bonuses and frequently visited the armies in the field.
There was an oath taken by each soldier every year to the emperor personally. In addition, the emperor Augustus and the subsequent emperors controlled all aspects of the military. All promotions, although of course actually might have been done locally, had to be approved by the emperor.
Augustus also created a whole new branch of the army, the auxiliary regiments, made up of non-citizens with specialist skills that the Romans didn't have.
They weren't very good archers. Generally speaking, they were not very good cavalrymen. So they would tend to recruit from people who did have those skills.
The Romans had often used foreign mercenaries, like archers and horsemen, for specific campaigns, but Augustus recruited non-citizens to auxiliary units for 25 years. After their terms, they were granted Roman citizenship, meaning their sons could join the legions. This kept the Roman army vigorous, with a constant supply of new blood. Over time, the ethnic makeup of the army changed dramatically. Under Augustus, the legions were 65% Italian, but a century later, the Italian proportion was less than 1%. However, that didn't change the discipline and nature of the army.
Many of its officers are still coming out from Italy. There's a strong continuity, but it also draws on the strengths and the abilities of all of those provincial peoples who were themselves becoming Romans. They were acquiring Roman citizenship. So it's still very much a Roman army, but it's Rome that's changing.
Another change Augustus brought in was the abolition of marriage for any soldier under the rank of centurion. Soldiers, he reasoned, were more efficient if they were wedded to discipline rather than wives.
There's a brutal side to this. Augustus is making sure, by disconnecting his armies with the local population, that those armies will be prepared to put those people to the sword if that's necessary.
But in reality, this didn't work. Many soldiers kept common law wives and children in nearby towns, which was tolerated because the sons made good recruits. Sometimes on the frontiers, families lived inside the forts, as evidence has shown at Vindolanda Fort in northern England.
You've got the women folk, the married soldiers. Some of them are certainly living inside the barrack buildings. I mean, in the early barrack building we looked at, there was quite a lot of women's footwear, babies' footwear and so on. And it would appear that, as in later armies, a number of rooms in the barrack buildings were allocated to married soldiers.
Augustus kept his legions busy, gradually expanding the empire. But expansion could exact a heavy price, as Augustus found when he tried to conquer Germany. The Romans had built 50 forts along the Rhine, including one reconstructed here at Xanten in Germany, as bases for their campaign. By around 7 AD, the Romans controlled Germany right up to the river Elbe, and Augustus put a man better known as an administrator than a general in charge. He was Quinctilius Varus, the husband of Augustus's grand niece, and he was given command of the 5 legions in Germany. But German tribes were planning a revolt. The leader of the Germans was Arminius, who'd once fought with the Romans as an auxiliary and knew their tactics. The Romans still trusted him as an ally, which made him the perfect person to set a trap. In 9 AD, he persuaded Varus to lead his army into this forest in northern Germany, on the pretext of quelling a local uprising.
The other side put on a very convincing story, you know. They said, look, there's trouble going on, I think you should intervene, and this is the best route to go. And they took him through marshy, very difficult country, and the Germans just prepared a fantastic ambush, and that was it.
Varus, disregarding warnings of a plot, led 3 entire legions plus their camp followers, some 30,000 people, into the Teutoburg forest. Most of them would never come out. When the Roman commander in Germany, Varus, led his 3 legions into this German forest in 9 AD, he was walking into one of the worst ambushes in history.
It began to rain, and they were making their way between the mountain on one side and the marsh to the other side. And then came the initial German attack, which was launched by spears from some distance at first, which killed quite a few of the Romans and put them into confusion.
The German warrior Arminius had caught the legions at their most vulnerable, hemmed in, unable to use the tactics and discipline that made them so powerful on open fields.
Imagine the scene in this forest 2,000 years ago.